Hello everyone, and welcome to Lecture 3. What we're going to be doing for this lecture is pivoting a little bit from what we talked about for the first 2 weeks, and this time focusing on a particular feature of some digital art. And that feature is going to be interactivity. So if you recall last week, we talked about Lopez's new art form of computer art, and a key feature of this computer art is that it's interactive, and it's interactive because it's run on a digital computer. Of course, we said in that lecture, really making sense of this notion requires that we understand what it means for an artwork to be interactive. So that's something we're going to try and make some headway on this lecture. In particular, the plan is to start out by gearing up and looking at some definitions or attempts to characterize the notion of interactivity. And again, what's important here is this notion of interactivity isn't going to be exclusive to digital art, but it's something that a lot of digital art will have. So according to Lopez and several other theorists, by being sort of made digitally or appearing on some sort of digital display, interactivity becomes a little bit easier. So this is something I think we'll probably have a little bit to talk about in our Q&A sessions. But yeah, so our first bit's going to be just trying to give something like a characterization or a definition of what it means to say a work is interactive. Once we have something like this in mind, and spoilers, we're not really going to have a great answer here. But once we have a kind of grip on what we mean by interactivity, we're going to turn and look at a puzzle from Kova and Garcia. They call it the puzzle of multiple endings, but really we can boil it down to, why aren't more fictions interactive? Why aren't more fictions full of things like divergent paths? Why is that what we might call traditional fictions, so the kind of novels that you tend to read, cinema that you tend to find, most plays, etc., why is it that they just have a kind of one path through the story rather than allowing for branchings? That'll be our second section. And then our third section, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about a question that emerges from our considerations in sections 1 and 2, and that will set us up for our lecture next time, which is going to be on collaboration and remixing. So that's the plan. Let's go ahead and get started by thinking about interactivity. So in order to kind of think about interactivity, I think it's maybe helpful to have a particular, we'll call it an art form, the genre, in mind. And a really useful one here is what we might call interactive fiction, or IF. So interactive fiction, as we'll use it for this little bit, is talking about a specific kind of work. Probably one of the most famous ones is Zork, or you might be familiar with games like King's Quest or Space Quest, right? Quest for Glory. A lot of questing here. Basically, they're right, fictions which explicitly, to use a quote from Nice and Holland in a precedent paper in 1984, they call upon the reader to interact with them by means of things like queries or replies. They have the reader take an active role in the story, and by taking this active role, it deliberately changes the development of plot, character, setting, or at least, at minimum, the kind of language or text produced. In effect, right, it's basically something like a fiction where you play a role. Um, so choose your own adventure books are like this. These sorts of old school adventure games are like this. Indeed, many contemporary video games arguably look like extensions of this very broad notion. But the particular notion of interactive fiction is really something that tends to be text-based, and it's one where there's a kind of cursor and you're allowed to input commands, and as you input commands, it modifies the story or the setting. So what's interesting about these interactive fictions is that, well, the story that these fictions are telling basically hinges upon the player doing stuff. If the player doesn't do anything, then the story doesn't continue. As Nice and Holland say, the story would not continue until the player gives some instructions, kind of says how the story at least will develop in some small way. And this isn't always true. I mean, obviously, some of these interactive fictions are going to have timeout things where if you don't respond in a certain amount of time, something's guaranteed to happen. Right? But the general idea of the story hinges upon the player making some kind of decision or performing some sort of fictional action. Right? And these are, I hope we can kind of get a grip on what these are like. One thing that's really interesting about many of these games, again, all of those Quest ones that I was just talking about, right, is instead of like having a reader or an audience member empathize with some hero figure, you're meant to kind of be the hero. That is, it's something like a day, say, imagining, maybe not imagining, but some sort of day, say, activity, and you, the player, right, are the one kind of doing the stuff, making the story happen, one way or the other. So these interactive fictions, really the first ones were probably developed in the mid 70s. There was one called Adventure, which eventually became Colossal Cave Adventure, and then evolved into Zork. Um, these were very limited in their ability to parse commands. There were very few things that the the fiction would basically allow you to do in any given room, was how it usually was said. Over time, the sort of parsers became more complex, um, allowing for more kinds of commands. So this is the Space Quest 1. Um, Eventually, the interface kind of got replaced. So instead of typing in commands, started using like mouse and keyboard interfaces, and eventually, for lots of them, just mice, right? Um, and again, what's kind of consistent in all of these is there's something like a story being told. The player is taking on not necessarily the protagonist, but some kind of figure that's typically heavily involved in the story, and exactly how things play out relies upon what the player does. So what you get is you get something that's a fiction, or something that looks an awful lot like a fiction, but it's very different than traditional fictions. In fact, as Neeson and Holland say, the resulting fiction is sufficiently different from traditional fictions, one might well wonder whether it counts as a real fiction at all. And it's different in the sense that instead of just getting a story that you can read and possibly interpret, but really just kind of given something that's packaged and you can engage with, the story is developed as one interacts with the work. You have to play in order for the fiction to be produced. And this isn't like, if we're just reading a novel, right, the story's kind of there. You can engage with it and then pick it up, come to learn about it. But it seems to be very different than what's going on with these interactive fictions. But of course, all of this requires we have a grip on what it means to be interactive. So this was kind of a warm up to say, like, hey, this interactivity stuff's kind of neat. But more generally, why think about this interactivity stuff? Well, we've kind of argued in the past two meetings that digital media, right, either displaying things on a digital object, so maybe on a laptop or a TV screen or a smart board or something like this, or making a work digitally, allows for or supports new art forms, including, and this is where things like Lopez's notion of computer art come in, art forms that are interactive. So these interactive fictions we just talked about, video games, which you can see as kind of not necessarily different in kind, um, AR, VR fictions, Lopez's notion of computer art, all of these are, it seems, essentially interactive, even in some kind of minimal way, that marks them, or at least feels, intuitively different than what we might have with traditional fictions, so novels, typical cinema, typical theater, etc. But how are they different? Well, it's one nice thing to say, hey, they're interactive, but that doesn't tell us nothing, right? We want to know what it means to be interactive. So, as Lopez comments, interactive is perilously close to being an empty buzzword. So, we need to come up with some idea about what it means. What is this notion of interactivity? How can we really pin down what's different about these kinds of works from things like novels, most theater, most cinema, etc.? That'll be our task for the first section here. And that's really the core of the paper we read from also Lopez, but much older, and really where one of the first pieces really developing an aesthetics of interactive art. So let's try and figure out what exactly interactivity is. So in the paper that we read, we have what we'll call a modifiable structure theory developed by Dom Lopez. The key here is a notion of structure. So Lopez says that structure is whatever intrinsic or representational properties a work has, the apprehension of which are necessary for aesthetic engagement with the work. Now, you'll note that this notion sounds an awful lot like something we talked about last week, namely a display. Right? Because notably, structure here, right, intrinsic or representational properties that a work has that you kind of need to engage with in order to aesthetically evaluate it. So for a piece of music, this is going to be, say, sound sequences. For a story, it's going to be something like maybe narrative content or fictional content, if it's a fiction, right? So structure here really means kind of something like the not necessarily purely formal, but the aesthetically relevant features of the work. So if you're reading a novel, right, the content of the novel is going to be its structure. If we're looking at a painting, it's literally what it looks like, the distribution of pigment across the surface. If it's a sculpture, right, what we're then going to be thinking about is, the three-dimensional surface and view of the particular sculpted object. Maybe also how it's sort of set out, its particular thing, right? You can kind of get an idea here. One thing to can think about is for different kinds of artworks, what's going to go into the structure here. So this is something that we'll come back to in a moment. So Lopez says, cool, let's take this notion of structure. Well, we can use the notion of structure to demarcate two senses of interactivity. Because, as I think we talked a little bit about in the discussion, there's this sense in which every artwork is interactive, at least in a kind of minimal way. That is, you have to engage with the work in order to appreciate it. You got to read the book, you got to watch the film, you got to listen to the song, you got to sit and watch the piece of theater. So Lopez says, cool, let's use this idea and let's define a notion of weak interactivity. So we'll say some object X is weakly interactive, if and only if X gives users control over the sequence in which they access the structure. So note, paintings are going to be weakly interactive because you can look at different parts, you can attend to different parts in whatever order you want. Novels are weakly interactive because you don't have to read it in the order it's written, you can kind of skip around. Cinema is going to be weakly interactive, especially with if you have a DVD, again, a point we'll come back to, right? You can watch the scenes in whatever order you like. You can kind of skip around. You can watch it in double speed, like I hope many of you are doing with these lectures, right? Again, it looks like every work is going to be weakly interactive. But that's not really cutting the mustard, right? We still want to distinguish between things like those interactive fictions we were talking about a second ago from traditional novels. So this is where we get the notion of strong interactivity. And we'll say a work is strongly interactive if and only if the work's structural properties, and we're using structure in this sense defined up here, are partially determined by the interactor's actions. So the idea is that, right, the intrinsic or representational properties, the apprehension of which are necessary for aesthetic engagement, that the work has, if those are partially determined by what an interactor does, then the work's going to be strongly interactive. So a painting isn't going to be strongly interactive because its intrinsic or representational features are fixed. They're fixed by, in this case, the painter. And we can change how we're accessing them. We can look at the painting in different ways, but those features are just there. And we're merely controlling how we access these features. We are not, in fact, modifying the features. Now, we could do something like, say, I don't know, move the painting into a room with a filtered light that then will change how it looks. Right? But no, what we're doing there isn't really something like making the painting strongly interactive. Instead, we're building something like a kind of display work. Right? So really, it's got a painting as a part and a room setting as a part, And that whole kind of thing is going to be part of the work that we produced. So again, that's the key kind of concept. A work's going to be weakly interactive if we can access its structure in this sense, and it'll be strongly interactive if and only if we can literally change the structure, or the structure comes into being as one engages with the work. So it's helpful here to think a little bit about the differences in the kinds of media. So in weakly interactive media, users' input determines which structure is accessed and the sequence in which it's accessed. So we can attend to certain parts of the painting, we might not look at certain bits of it, right? And there what we're doing is just engaging with stuff that's there, the structure in this technical sense that's already there. Contrast that, in strongly interactive media, the structure itself is shaped and often brought into being by the interactor's choices. So Lopez has a really helpful metaphor here, I think, which is about exploration. So merely weakly interactive works can be explored in the sense that there are these structures, like the structure's there, and you can explore, go out and find it. You might not necessarily have engaged with the whole work yet, so you can do this sort of exploration. There really is something that's over the hill, right? You can go look at it. In contrast, strongly interactive works can't be explored in this sense. That's because it's not like there's these structures for you to access. In order for the structures to come into being, you have to interact with the work in a certain kind of way. Until you interact with it, the structure's just not there. It's not like there's something over the hill, because the area over the hill doesn't exist until you kind of bring it about. That's the big difference. So engaging with something that's already there and having something like a kind of epistemic challenge, right? Coming to terms with these structural features versus generating the structural features by playing with the work. So that's our first kind of characterization of interactivity. And it works pretty well. It seems to broadly pull the right things apart. Paintings, most cinema, etc., all going to be weakly interactive, but not strongly, whereas video games, interactive fictions, etc., are all going to be strongly interactive. So that's cool. Looks pretty good. But yeah, again, to really drive the idea home, the important thing is, in some sense, with a strongly interactive work, to go with what Sneese and Holland say, there's a kind of textuality difference. So when we're thinking about a strongly interactive art like Myst, right, there's no real text. The text comes into being when one engages with it. So the playing generates rather than reveals the work. That's the key difference. So again, interesting characterization, seems kind of plausible. But of course, there's always going to be some issues. So in order to kind of get a grip on the issues, we can think a little bit about the structure of these fictions. So, and I'm using fiction here in a very broad sense. So fiction can include things like cinema and theater, etc. We'll focus, just for now, on traditional fiction, so something like novels, versus interactive fictions, so something like, say, choose-your-own-adventure books. The difference in structure here is pretty straightforward. In your traditional fiction, you have a kind of linear or serial structure. We've got information, content, structure, in Lopez's sense, right? That's being presented by the author in some kind of sequence. And of course, readers can read that sequence, they can change the sequence of access, but they're just changing the access, the structure's there. Contrast that with an interactive fiction, even these choose-your-own-adventure cases, which are kind of minimally strongly interactive. The structure here is broadly tree-shaped. As Sneese and Holland say, the author's still in control. They've set up all the nodes and the possible pathways, but the exact route through the kind of narrative tree, what turns out to get fictionalized, what gets made fictionally true, will be determined by what decisions the reader makes. And of course, some of these stories are going to be very minimal in terms of what kind of interactivity they support. So Islands of Time, 115th book in this series, it doesn't really have that many nodes. There's not that many choices you can make. It's not a very good book. It's not a very good book. It's not a very good interactive book either. But importantly, right, what we would have is a different fiction, a different story with a different structure depending upon which particular choices you make. So even in this kind of minimal tree-like case, you're still going to have a particular story that gets generated depending upon which route you take through the choice structure. And then Mystery of the Maya, one of the early ones, a very good one, is actually set up in such a way that it's got a whole bunch of different nodes, a whole lot of different ways it can go, some of which even allow you to kind of loop back to the beginning. And yeah, you could theoretically just keep playing this book for forever if you make the right sort of decisions every time. But note, what's interesting there is, again, the actual content, the structure in Lopez's sense of the term, will be determined by what options a player chooses. So it's revealed in this sense, or sorry, it's constructed, to go back, right? It's generated in the sense that while there are all these nodes, and what we're doing is kind of picking which ones are getting fictionalized, in the picking, we're generating the relevant fictional content for that story. Contrast that with what goes on in a traditional fiction, where you're engaging with it, right? You're kind of revealing what's fictionally true. And maybe there's something like interpretation going on, so you're having to do some intellectual work, right? But it's not like you're making the fictional content. It's not like you're helping to construct the story. So that's the basic idea of Lopez's modifiable structure theory. It's really cool. Doesn't work, though. So the biggest reason to think it doesn't work comes from a very nice paper by Aaron Smuts. So Smuts sets out to kind of give a characterization of interactivity. And Smuts says quite some nice things about Lopez's theory. But he notes that it faces a pretty significant objection. And the objection's easiest to get around by thinking about a particular example. So the example that Smuts uses is Memento. Actually, no, I think he uses Pulp Fiction, but it works better with Memento. So spoilers on this, if you haven't seen the movie, I'll try and keep it pretty vague. But there's a very important thing about this movie, is the way it's presented. So the film isn't presented in chronological order. If you watch it through, you don't get the events that happen in chronological order. You get them in this kind of weird mixed up order that's meant to kind of help you understand what it's like to have this, the problem the main character has, which is that he's not able to form any more he doesn't have short-term memory anymore. He can't form memories. But note, if you have a DVD of Memento, what you can do, right, a DVD, which is meant to be a paradigmatic, weekly interactive work, you can watch the film in chronological order. And when you watch it in chronological order, you fundamentally change its structure. And again, structure here in Lopez's sense. Why? Because if you watch the film in chronological order, you're really going to change its aesthetic features. One of the aesthetically powerful things about this film is the way that it's presented, which is determined by the order that you access the various parts. So if you change the order you access the various parts, you really screw up its aesthetic features, or at least you change them pretty significantly. And we could do the same thing with lots of works, more broadly, right? Anything that's weakly interactive that allows us to, manipulate the order that we access the already existing structure, well, with a lot of these works, that order of presentation plays a big part in setting out its aesthetic features, its structure, in this loaded sense. That means that actually lots of works that aren't meant to be strongly interactive are going to turn out to be too. And that's bad. So Lopez's whole attempt to do a disambiguation looks like it fails. And that's a shame. So that's a kind of interesting objection. There's a similar one that I think is also quite powerful, which comes about when we think about things like typical novels. So lots of times when we're thinking about novels, one of the things we have to do is we're going to have something like explicit content, so what we're told is fictionally true, but we also have to do a little bit of work and figure out some things that are entailed or implied or suggested by what we're explicitly told. And in those cases, we're basically inventing this fictional content. We're doing what's often called importing the content. But if we're importing the content, then it looks like the content wasn't there to begin with. So this will make typical novels strongly interactive. Again, intuitively incorrect. So, right, there's an original account of interactivity from Lopez. Looks really good, runs into some problems, doesn't quite do everything we want it to do. So what other options do we have? Well, as I said, Smuts comes up with his own account. And his suggestion, we can kind of call it conversational model. The reason why is Smuts bases the notion of interactivity off what he takes to be a paradigmatic instance of interaction, which is a conversation. So Smuts says something is interactive, so a work is interactive, if and only if it's responsive, it doesn't completely control, is not completely controlled, and doesn't respond in a completely random fashion. So what we mean by doesn't completely control, it allows the player to kind of do things that aren't just simply rigidly fixed. It might have some kind of control. So for example, thinking about the Choose Your Own Adventure books, those ones are fairly controlling in that you don't really have a whole lot of options, but you still have options. And in that sense, it's not completely controlling. It's restrictive, but not completely controlling. Similarly, it isn't completely controlled. And this is an interesting point. So Smuts backs up this idea with the thought that, look, if you're simply controlling a conversation, that is, if you know exactly how to get someone to say what you want them to say by kind of leading them in a certain kind of way, you're not having an interaction. It's just a manipulation. So if we grant that, 3 looks pretty natural. And then finally, 4 is designed basically just to rule things out like dice or coin flips or anything that's just complete noise. We want it to be some kind of law-like or patterned behavior, but not a completely controlled one and not a completely random one. So 2 things. This is an interesting kind of account of what interactivity is. And it seems to do okay with regards to getting the extension of the notion right. 2 kind of problems with it. First problem, this kind of model, this stereotypical case of interaction that Smuts uses, doesn't actually seem to fit very well when we think about interactive works. Because a conversation isn't something that has an author and then players that are engaged with it, right? Or an artist and players that are engaged with it. Conversations have multiple authors. It's a bunch of people, all of whom take on something like the artist or the authorial role. They're all serving, right, to kind of generate and form the conversation. That doesn't really seem to fit when we think about interactive works. Because interactive works, there's something like an author who's set out the bulk of the work, and then players can maybe make some decisions, pick which tree pathway we're going to go down, right? They manipulate, they change again in Lopez's sense, the structure, right? But they're something like secondary to the authorial roles. So conversation looks like actually kind of a bad thing to base an account of interactivity on. There's already something a little bit fishy here. Relatedly, this account of interactivity seems to fall apart when you get good, right? That is, once you start to master what was an interactive work, according to Smuts, it no longer is interactive. Smuts says when you develop complete mastery over something, it ceases to be interactive for you. And this is again because of 3. It's not completely controlled. According to Smuts, if you can completely control something, it's not interactive. And I don't really have a terribly potent argument here, but I just want to say that seems really wrong. It seems fair to say, right, works can be more or less interactive. Just think about our two choose your own adventure books we referenced a few slides ago. But to say that something ceases to be interactive once you know exactly how it works, that seems to get it fundamentally wrong. Because what you know how to do is interact with the work in a certain kind of way to produce something like, again in the Lopez sense, the structure that you're interested in. So there's something kind of fishy with this characterization of interactivity. Exactly what it is hard to pin down. Maybe we can talk about it in the discussion. So we've had two accounts, right? One from Lopez, one from Smuts. Now actually in the book that we read the first couple chapters of, Lopez comes up with another account of interactivity, and partially because he takes on board the objections from Smuts. And his new account of interactivity, we can call it prescription theory. And the prescription theory says, look, a work is interactive if and only if it prescribes the actions of its user help generate its display. Another reason we have to have this prescription, so there's a kind of normativity, is because we also want to avoid making paintings interactive because you can go and slash them. Right? So you can slash a painting. Cool. That doesn't make the painting interactive because you're not prescribed to slash the painting. You're prescribed to look at it, think about it, right? Something like that. Slashing, right out, right? So we can then also use this account to give a notion of degrees, right? So a work of art is interactive to the degree that the actions of its users help generate its display, where display is here used in the same way that we talked about in our last lecture. And finally, we can say a user interacts with a work of art if and only if she acts so as to generate its display in a prescribed manner. So, right, slashing a painting doesn't count as interacting with in the appropriate way because it's not a prescribed way of engaging with the painting. Now, one thing to note about this account is that we have to make sense of this notion of prescription. Where is it coming from? Where is the normativity coming from? Is it coming purely by authorial fiat? So an author or an artist is going to determine the ways that you're meant to or that you should engage with the work? Is it going to come something like maybe baked into, to go back to our first lecture, the category that the work is an instance of? So maybe certain categories will have kind of prescriptions loaded into them and they might change over time. Is it something, so in a much earlier paper, one we haven't talked about, Kendall Walton came up with the idea of a kind of aesthetic principle where the prescription comes from thinking that you should engage with the work to make it as aesthetically valuable as possible. That seems maybe plausible for some cases, but again, that uses a notion of should. It's not really clear where this should's getting its power from. So Lopez's second theory, this prescription theory, looks really cool, but we need to figure out where the source of normativity is. Not really obvious. But there's one last one I want to talk to you about. And in order to talk to you about it, we're going to have to take a little detour. So here's a little interlude on a Waltonian theory of fiction. So we've mentioned Kendall Walton already. Walton, in his famous book Mimesis is Make-Believe, very cool, fun stuff to read, comes up with a general theory about representational works. And Walton's key idea is that engaging with these works involves what he calls games of make-believe. So when we engage with a representative work, be it a fiction, be it a three-dimensional work here, like this little bicycle seat and piece, right? What we do is we play a game of make-believe. So we make believe that this is a cow skull. When I'm reading Harry Potter, I make believe that Snape is a person and Harry's a wizard. So, yeah, I should use a different example. That's a bad one. Anyway, scratch the Potter reference. Earthsea, that Gad is a wizard. So again, the core idea for Walton, we're playing these games of make believe. These games of make believe are basically just like the kinds of games that we might play as kids. We play stuff like Cops and Robbers, or spice up our hide and seek game by pretending we've got treasure, right? They're basically just imaginative activities where we're taking everyday things and we're bolstering them by building in what we'll call fictional content. So, for example, right, this is just a bicycle seat with some metal, but we can play a game of make-believe where this is a skull. So what we'll then say is, right, there's some fictional content, which is that wherever this thing is, there's a skull there. And this already highlights something. The imaginative activity, the game of make-believe we're playing, isn't completely chaotic. It's not anything goes. It's not Calvin Ball. Right? It's constrained. It's guided. Some activities, some imaginings, some moves in the game of make-believe are going to be okay, and some aren't. So what's going to do the constraining? Well, there's going to be two things that really help here. First are going to be what we'll call props. So props are objects whose existence and or features are used to guide and determine features of the imagined game world. And for example, I've got my little bear puppet here. Bear puppet is a perfect prop, right? Because what we've really got is just some, little fuzz and some black beads and some stitching and stuff, right? But what we're supposed to imagine if we're playing the bear puppet game is that wherever this object is, that's where the bear is. Similarly, we just mentioned with the previous one, wherever this metal and leather thing goes, we're supposed to imagine, oh, there's a cow skull there. So the nature and features of the prop, in these cases, right, it was just their spatial location, are going to then determine and guide what we're meant to make believe. Namely, wherever this thing is, we're supposed to make believe there's a bear. Wherever the cow skull thing goes, we're supposed to make believe it's a cow skull. So the props will then help determine what's proper or improper for a given game of make-believe. The other thing that's going to do it are principles of generation. And these can basically be thought of as rules, and they fix prescriptions to imagine. So these can have several different structures. One is a conditional one. So we might say something like, hey, here's the principle of generation for this game. If there's a tree stump, imagine it's a bear. So you've got a prescription. If there's a tree stump, then you should imagine it's a bear if you want to play the game. It can be stipulative. You should imagine there's a bear in the room. This works better for in person, obviously, right? Because now we all start freaking out, right? Or it can be kind of supplemental. So we might say something like, oh, hey, and if you imagine there's a bear in the room, then imagine it's a Kodiak bear. Again, what all of these are doing is they have explicit kind of prescriptions baked into them. They're saying, if you want to play the game, then you should imagine this. So here's where our kind of normativity is coming in. And it's being guided by prompts and fixed by possibly just pure stipulative or conditional principles of generation. So this is the Waltonian framework. Walton's framework allows us to do a whole bunch of things. We can now account for pretty much any engagement with the representational works. Again, we can read fiction in this way. The prop is going to be the letters on the page. We can do theater. Props are going to be people and literal props and settings, etc. We can even use ourselves as props if we're playing, say, tabletop games or live-action role play, or even just maybe imagining that we're part of a film or imagining we're part of a setting. Again, props are pretty much anything that's there we can use. Principle generation are going to be the rules that guide the game. Now, why have this interlude on Walton? Well, two neat things follow. First, we can get a notion of what we'll call a Walt fiction. A Walt fiction is a work whose function is to serve as a prop in a game of make-believe. So, the bear puppet is a Walt fiction. This leather and metal thing, it's a Walt fiction. Tom Nook, this sort of digital image, a Walt fiction. My copy of Earthsea, a Walt fiction. All of these things are works, and note we don't have to say artwork, right? It's just some kind of object, produced work, whose function is to serve as a prop in a game of make-believe. And note also, function here isn't exclusive, so we could have something that's both a prop and a real-world helpful thing. I was going to use a bad example, I won't, right? What's weird, though, is, of course, if we think of this notion as a fiction, and this is why we'll call it world fiction, it applies fairly broadly. Paintings are going to count as world fictions, puppets, dolls, video games, books, anything that's designed to help you play a game of make-believe. Right? This also helps us make sense of a notion of fictionality. That is, when is a particular piece of content true in a fiction? Right? So we'll basically say a proposition is going to be true in a fiction if and only if either a prompt or a principle of generation says you're prescribed to imagine that content. Okay, now all of that in mind. Finally, come back to thinking about interactivity. So we can use Walton's theory of interactivity to offer up another account Walton's theory of fiction to offer up another account of interactivity. And this is something that Buddy and I have done, and it's very close to Lopez's prescription theory, but it uses the Walton framework to kind of give an answer to where the prescription comes from, gives an answer to where the should comes from. So here's the idea. Fictions, and here we can again focus on this really broad case, so novels, cinema, theater, right? Anything that has kind of fictive content. Fictions are incomplete, or they're almost always incomplete. They tend to have truth value gaps. So, for example, right, we've got Harry here. Right? Is it true or false in Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone that Harry has type A blood? Doesn't really say. Is it true or false that Harry has an even number of hairs on his head? Or an odd number of hairs on his head? It's not like the intuitive idea here is there's not really a fact of the matter. There's just no truth there. It's neither true nor false that Harry has an odd number of hairs on his head. It's just not true or false. Right? And again, the idea is the gap isn't an epistemic one. It's not like, okay, do I have an even or an odd number? Well, we don't know, but there's bound to be an answer. Contrast, in the Harry Potter books, there's just no answer. It just seems like it's kind of a misfire of a question to even worry about it. So there's this truth value gap. There's an incompleteness. What's interesting is it looks like there's different kinds of incompleteness. So one kind is a kind of permissive one. And this is where you're permitted to imagine like one option or another, but there's no prescription either way. So, for example, you're permitted to imagine that Harry has type A blood, or type AB, or whatever. But there's no prescription to imagine either one of these. The fiction just lets you fill it in however you like. Contrast the permissive one with the prohibitive cases. Prohibitive incompleteness happens when you're prescribed to imagine a disjunction, but you're not permitted to imagine either disjunct. So, my favorite example for this, the original Blade Runner movie, amazing movie. The whole point of the movie is to leave it ambiguous as to whether Deckard is a human or a replicant. There are clues and hints to kind of push you in both directions. But it looks like you misunderstand the film if you think it's supposed to answer that question. Because the whole point of the film is to leave that question up in the air. To not tell you whether he's one or the other. Because the whole point of the film is to try and get you to understand that it's not really clear what the difference is between the replicants and the humans. So what we have is there's a prescription to imagine either Deckard's human or he's a replicant, but you're not permitted to imagine that Deckard's a human, because to do that, you're foreclosing off the other option. And you're not permitted to imagine that Deckard's a replicant, because again, then you're foreclosing the other option and you're losing the ambiguity. You have to have the ambiguity to appreciate the film. So you have a truth value gap. Is he a human or not? But you're not allowed to fill it in. Again, contrasting with the Harry Potter blood case, where it doesn't kind of matter. In this case, no, it matters, and you're not allowed to pick either option. So those are our first two types. Here's our third one, and this is where we can get interactivity. There looks like there might be choice incompleteness. So choice incompleteness comes about when you're prescribed to either imagine P or to imagine Q, but there's no prescription to imagine P, and there's no prescription to imagine Q. So, let's give an example. Dark Souls. This is the one we use for our paper. We always come back to it. Richard still basically does nothing but stream Dark Souls all the time. So, there's a couple options. There's some optional things. For example, you might go to particular areas in a particular order. Right? Now, notably in these cases, let's take the final bit. You can either link the flame or let it die. The final choice in the game. You have either option. What's nice about the game then, again using the Walton framework, is you've got a prescription to imagine either that you link the flame, or you've got a prescription to imagine that you let the fire die. But there's no prescription to imagine that you link the flame, and there's no prescription to imagine that you let it die. So, be clear, right? What we have is the game is forcing you to say, hey, you've got to make a choice. There's a prescription to pick an option, but there's no prescription to pick any particular option. In that sense, it's kind of the opposite of the prohibitive one. Prohibitive one says you've got to have these two options, but you can't choose either one. In the choice case, it says, hey, you've got your two options and you got to pick one, but I don't care which one of the two you pick. So what's interesting about choice and completeness is it looks like it only comes up when we actually have interactive works. Because it's by choosing, by imagining one of these two, by making fictional one of our two options, that we then make whichever one we pick part of the relevant fiction's content. So if we choose to link the flame, right, that will then be true in the fiction. If we choose to let the fire die and usher in the age of dark, cool, then that's what's true in the fiction. Right? And we'll also always have, could have done the other one, blah, blah, blah. But importantly, when we make one of the choices, that's the one that becomes part of the content. That becomes part of the structure in Lopez's sense. So what's nice is this theory, which is driven by fictional truth, seems to kind of, one, supply a prescriptive element that Lopez's story was missing, and two, links Lopez's prescription theory up with something really fundamental about fictional truth, namely this stuff about incompleteness. Of course, it's got problems. Everything does. I'm looking forward to you guys ripping it to pieces when we talk about it. So, okay, let's go back. So what have we done? Well, we talked about 4 different stories with regards to interactivity. Lopez's original sort of modifiable structure theory, Smuts's conversational model, Lopez's prescription model, and then this one from Rich and I, where we're using fictional incompleteness. Now, really, the upshot is none of them seem to really completely characterize the interactivity notion that we wanted. One thing that does seem to be clear, though, is there's something like this imaginative prescription or imaginative normativity, and something like making the content rather than just discovering the content. Exactly how to characterize it, though, is still a little bit up in the air. More generally, we also still have several substantive questions. So, note, all we've done really is talk about how to make sense of interactivity. We haven't really talked too much about how a work's being interactive or being non-interactive will impact our aesthetic appreciation of it. And similarly, we haven't really said much about how we do or how we should aesthetically appreciate interactive works. So we need to say something more here. And this, I think, will be a good point for us to talk about in our discussion period. Again, we've tried to make sense of various ways to characterize interactivity, to pull it apart, to really delineate the genuine interactive works from the non-interactive or merely weakly interactive ones. We've done our best. It's not really clear if any of them succeed. Cool. So that's our first part done. Way too long. Sorry for rambling. What we're going to do now in the second part is we're going to turn to look at a puzzle from Cova and Garcia, where basically we're wondering why is it that more works aren't interactive? Something along these lines. So thanks for coming, and hopefully I'll see you in part 2.